Today marks All Saints' Day, also known as All Hallows' Day or the Feast of All Hallows. That's why Halloween is called that. It's All Hallows' Eve. The day itself celebrates saints, but the far more interesting day for folklore is tomorrow, All Souls' Day. All Souls' Day marks remembrance of the dead, whether that's visiting graves, praying for the dearly departed, or practicing other family customs. Given it's a day dedicated to the dead, I thought it would be a great time to hear some more unnerving and uncanny experiences from listeners of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well. I do hope that you also enjoyed last week's slightly different episode, where it was the same content you would normally get, but it was recorded live at a conference. I'm not entirely sure that I would want to do that again, because it was quite unnerving, but there we go. We are talking about other unnerving things this week, because we are going to have a look at listener experiences before we move on in the rest of November to look at the folklore of islands. So we'll be looking at the likes of Drake Island, which is next, which was a request, and there's a couple of others that I've got on the list that I've completely forgotten about. But if there's anything specific that you would like me to cover in terms of islands that I haven't already done, please do feel free to let me know in whichever way you want. And if I can fit it in, I would love to. So that's the plan for November. December's actually going to be slightly different from what I planned, because I was going to try and keep it like a festive free zone like I did last year. But I'm also absolutely and utterly exhausted from everything that I've been doing this year. So what I'm actually going to be doing is festive folklore, but with friends. So I'm going to have some very special guests to come on to talk about festive folklore that they're aware of, what's going on in their area, what traditions they practice, things like that. So it will be a bit more festive than we might otherwise have done. And yes, there is actually an entire episode that is going to be my attempt at a Christmas ghost story. So move over, Mark Gattis. But anyway, that's just to let you know what's coming for the rest of the year. There will, of course, be your Fabulous Folklore Presenter episodes as well, so there's still plenty of content for you to get your teeth into in the remainder of 2025, which, I don't know about you, seems to have come around really, really quickly. But anyway, so we're going to start off with the first of these stories, and I'll be honest with you, I've only skim read them while I was deciding whether they fitted into listener experiences or the other theme, which was actually where I was asking people to tell me the creepiest stories they'd heard about places. These were the particular stories where people still gave experiences of people they knew, whereas I was looking for more generic sort of stories that everyone in an area would know. But because they're still really creepy, I want to include them anyway. So I've just moved them to this point in the year because they do involve people experiencing something weird. I'm not going to comment on any of them or anything like that. We're just going to enjoy these experiences. And I am going to throw in one of my own at the end, which is a one I'd completely forgotten about, but we'll come back to that at the end. So I want to start off with the first one, because that's a good place to start. And this particular one, it was anonymous, but it happened in Innsbruck in Austria. The listener heard the story from their aunt, but as the story is about the aunt's personal experience, that's why it's in this episode. So the story runs as follows. There is a fairly new university building in Innsbruck called the Sowie Building, which houses the social studies and economy departments of the local university. Fairly new means it was built in the 1990s or early 2000s. Before the university building was built, there was an army barracks, and before that, there was a nunnery on the site. The nunnery was closed down in the 18th century, and the barracks was in use until the 1980s, when the building was sold to the city and then demolished. There have been ghost stories attached to the barracks that I've been aware of before my aunt added to this. In the 19th century, there were reports of a ghostly nun walking around in the building at night and slapping recruits' faces. There was some strange stuff happening in the Sowie building too, and there were even reports about the Sowie nun in the local media, when, shortly after the new building opened to the public, a piece of ceiling collapsed for no apparent reason. My aunt's story goes back to the time when the barracks were still in use. My aunt was born in the late 1940s, and what she told me happened to her mum while she worked in the barrack kitchen, so it must have been shortly before or during World War II. From the kitchen, she often had to go downstairs to the cellars to fetch things from the storerooms there, and she told my aunt she really hated doing that because she always felt watched or followed, which frightened her. She was not the only one who felt that way either, so whenever they could, she and her colleagues would accompany each other down to the cellars to make sure no one was following them. She was quite certain it was a ghost watching her and not, say, one of the recruits playing a prank on them, because there would never be anyone if she turned around to look. That's the end of that story. And that's just that general level of creepy malaise that I absolutely love in a story where you can't put your finger on quite exactly what's going on. It's just not right. So I thought that was, and it was also interesting that the newer building also seems to be having the same problem. So if you go to that particular university where there's a Sowie building, then do please feel free to let me know if stuff is still happening there, because that would be interesting to know. The next story is also anonymous, and this one comes from Singapore. And this one reads, Changi is known to be one of the most haunted spots in Singapore. It used to have kampongs/villages. My best friend was staying with her grandmother, I think, and where they lived was known to have a Pontianak, a kind of undead vampiric she-ghoul. One night when my friend was sleeping, she was awakened by a thud on the iron roof, and then another thud. 2 Pontianaks had landed on the roof. My friend could hear their long fingernails scratching the corrugated iron roof. They were trying to get in. They couldn't. The house was protected by Quranic verses. Oh my God! I feel like I need to know more about that one, quite frankly. That just sounds properly creepy. It was obviously really interesting to hear this particular one from Singapore, but it's just, I think it's the fingernails scratching on metal. Ooh, you can just hear that, can't you? Ugh. There, that one really creeped me out when I read that one for the first time. And our next story is from Camilla about Colombia. And Camilla says, in the Colombian plains, which are an entryway to the Amazon rainforest, there is a belief that unbaptized children can be stolen by witches, and that witches live around the plains and can take away cattle when angered. The Bruja del Llano is usually a woman who can shapeshift into a big black vulture, and sometimes a snake. The witch steals the soul of the child, but is also allied with the duendes, a somewhat hybrid between a poltergeist and a leprechaun, who will scratch children and tangle their hair to signal they are on the witch's site. In this story, my aunt took her baby to the plains to have a rural getaway. At that time, the child remained unbaptized. They were visited by a woman asking for a glass of water, who mysteriously disappeared when they came back to the door. They were warned by locals that a witch had seen the child and that they should remain inside the house at night. During the following days, the baby showed tiny scratches on his arms and had trouble sleeping. The mom picked up the baby and took him outside to calm him down, and she saw a big black vulture staring at them from a nearby tree. The vulture did not move, and my aunt came back inside. She recalls feeling observed and threatened, and describes the vulture to have had a very smart shine in its eyes. The following night, the vulture started circling the house. They could see the shadow passing by the windows, and eventually they heard a loud bang on the roof, as if something heavy had landed on top of the house. They heard steps and scratches coming from above. The baby cried all night, and in the morning they ran to the nearest church to get the baby baptized. After that, there were no more events, and they came back to the city. I'm so glad to hear that the baby was okay, because you do start to get a bit worried with that one. It was really interesting because that's the kind of story that you imagine would have happened in an earlier century. But to hear it now, you just go, oh, that is chilling. So as I say, glad to hear the baby's okay, but also, yeah, again, it's one of those kind of stories where you just sort of go, I don't know how I would react in that situation. I hope I'm never in that situation. So thank you very much, Camilla, for that one. So Paul submitted this next experience, who heard it from his cousin in Corby, Northamptonshire, and he has called his cousin Brenda for the sake of the story. But as Paul says, this happened about 6 years ago, so late 2018, early 2019. While Brenda was babysitting her 3-year-old granddaughter Olivia, she took her upstairs to use the bathroom. After making sure hands had been washed, Brenda said, "Do you want to help me with the laundry now?" Olivia nodded. "Let's go and get the dirty clothes from Uncle Harry's room." Harry is Brenda's younger son. "No, Nanny, don't go in there," Olivia said. "Why not?" Brenda asked. "Because the man is in there," Olivia said matter-of-factly. This troubled Brenda, so she carried on with the questioning. "What man?" "The man with the hammer. He's shouting at us to go away," said Olivia. "Are you frightened of him?" Brenda pushed. "No, he's sad and just wants to be left alone." Shaken up, Brenda took a perfectly happy Olivia downstairs to do some different chores instead. I have heard a story from more than one source, which lends a creepy air of authenticity to Olivia's tale. When Olivia's dad Josh still lived at home, him and his brother Harry would play football in their large backyard, and inevitably the ball would go over the fence into next door's garden. One time Josh and Harry came running home crying, and when asked what was wrong by their dad Jeff, they told him that the old man had caught them sneaking into his garden to get their ball and had chased them with a hammer. Jeff went next door to tell the old man off for scaring his boys, but he told a different story. He said he had been in the shed doing some woodwork when he saw the boys sneaking into his yard, so he leaned out of the shed, hammer still in hand, and yelled at them to leave him alone. He apologised for scaring them, as that wasn't his intention, but told them to just knock his door and ask politely next time, and he would happily let them into the yard, or would throw it over for them. When the old man died about 10 years ago, Josh bought and renovated the house for his family. Of course, you do have to wonder, is the old man still knocking around in the house or not? It is a pretty creepy story, and I think the bit that's quite interesting about that is how matter-of-fact Olivia is about the fact there's just a man in the room. So yeah, that one's another one of those ones where you sort of think there's different elements of the family seem to have experienced this particular person. So who knows what's going on there. Our next story is also anonymous, and this one occurred in Jackson, Ohio. This one's quite a short one, and it says, I was working on the basement of the house, up on a stepladder stringing Ethernet cable. The family was out shopping, but due home soon. I heard footsteps walking from the garage towards the master bedroom, right overhead. I finish with the cables and head upstairs to see if my wife needs any help. I go into the master bedroom, empty. Check the kitchen, kids' rooms, empty. I think for a second, then I check the garage, empty. No car, no one is home. It creeped me out, and I did not go back to the basement that day. I never told anyone that story. And I think there's actually few things that are creepier than footsteps in a house which you don't realise at the time is actually empty. So they're not creepy when you hear them, they're creepy when you realise that nobody could have made them. So I can understand how that would have made you go, I'm not going in that basement. I totally understand that. So Becky submitted this next story, which happened in St. Charles, Illinois, and her grandmother told the story to Becky's mother, which was her daughter-in-law, and she told this story. After my grandma June was widowed at 53, she rented half a house that had been split in half from front to back, each with its own entrance. This was probably in the mid to late 1970s. A man was hired to paint the exterior of the house. While painting, he happened to see an elderly woman in the home. Later, while painting the other side of the home, he saw the same woman, and they smiled and waved to each other. At the end of the day, the other tenant, not my grandmother, returned home from work. The workman spoke to them for a few minutes and happened to mention the elderly lady in the home. The tenant said that no one was home that day, no elderly lady lived there, and there was no internal access from one side of the home to the other. The workman refused to return to the home the next day to finish painting the house because he was so frightened by the event. In the same house, my grandmother was sleeping one night with her little dog Briar curled up next to her. In the middle of the night, she was woken by her bed shaking. She opened her eyes and saw Briar standing on the bed near the foot, frantically wagging his tail, which is what was making the bed shake. My grandmother looked to see why her dog was so excited, and there was a little girl in Victorian-era clothing standing at the foot of her bed. Oh, God, that would terrify me. My grandmother wasn't afraid because her dog was so happy to see the little girl. The little girl slowly faded away, and as far as I know, my grandmother never saw her again. I suppose, yeah, Briar being pleased to see the kid, you'd be like, is this a creepy girl ghost, or is it just a girl ghost? But still, oh, you don't want to see that at the foot of your bed, though, do you? Oh, little girl ghosts always freak me out, so that was a good story. So Lexi from Germany submitted our next story, who heard this story from her mum. And she said, when my mum was pregnant with my little sister, one night her granddad appeared in her dream. She wanted to talk with him and tell him all about how well her pregnancy was going, but he just smiled and said, I'm sorry, I have to go. When she asked where to, he only repeated, I'm sorry, I have to go, and she suddenly knew that she wouldn't see him alive ever again. Since it was the 1980s and we lived in East Germany, having a phone in a household was extremely uncommon, so my mom only got the affirmation later in the afternoon when my dad came home. Her mother had to go to one of the neighbours to call my dad at the office, so my dad could tell her later at home, but she already knew because my great-granddad had already told her. 2 weeks later, my baby sister was born, happy, healthy, and to this day with a level of energy that I can only dream of. I was only 6 years old back then, but she told me about the story a few years later, and retold it a couple of times over the years. Interestingly, my little sister is convinced that she remembers our great-granddad, even though they have never met. So that's one of those stories where it's not necessarily creepy, it's actually weirdly comforting. But at the same time, it would be a really sad thing to encounter, that you kind of get that crisis apparition, as it were, to give you a piece of news that you're going to hear later on. It must be really unsettling to have that kind of thing happen. Mark submitted this next story from Wester Ross in Scotland, and he heard it from the cleaners at the school he worked at. And he says, they were cleaning of an afternoon, their own children playing in and around the building. One of the children went into the girls' toilet and could hear a girl singing in a stall. Their mums thought must be one of the lassies come back. She didn't answer when asked. Another cleaner was fetched and heard her sing. As she clearly wasn't for coming out, they left her to it. Later that day, a girl in old-fashioned clothes was seen walking up the main corridor by them. She came back a couple of times, the wee lassie of the toilets. And I like the fact that the girl's singing, because it makes it sound like she's possibly not having a horrible time. But again, we've got another creepy girl ghost there. So I thought it was quite interesting that two of them have shown up in this episode so far. So it was quite interesting that the cleaners had encountered that. And then V submitted this story, which happened to her mother in a hotel. And she said, my mother went out of town to visit my sister, who was staying temporarily in a mental hospital. I was away. She's better now. My mother booked a random hotel, and it was basically a perfectly normal experience. At first. By that I mean there wasn't a, well, this house is haunted, or so I've heard from anyone working there when she checked in. She was checked into room 617, I think, and she went to bed pretty quickly, as it was around 10 p.m-ish. She couldn't sleep for some reason, and when she did fall asleep, she woke up suddenly, afraid, and saw in the corner of her eye something weird. A pair of man's hands held out, palms forward, next to her bedside, as if it was coming from someone crouched next to her bed about to touch her. She was paralysed with fear and closed her eyes, praying to God since she's religious. As soon as she started praying, the toilet in her hotel room flushed. I think she also mentioned feeling watched and swearing up and down she heard a whisper, and she couldn't sleep for a long time. I'm absolutely not surprised, by the way. I wouldn't be able to sleep after that either. When she checked out, the guy working at the front, who was different from when she checked in, saw the room she was in and exclaimed, "Oh, 617, that's the room next to the most haunted room," or something along those lines. And she was like, that wasn't a nightmare, and had a conversation with him about her experience. He told her the story of why the hotel is haunted, but I can't remember any of that because I was freaked out. My mother wasn't a believer of the paranormal until she had that experience, so I believed her. It was told to me about 2 years ago, so I can't remember every detail, unfortunately. I don't think you really need every detail in that story, because that is really creepy. Anything that happens while you're asleep and you're in bed, which is a pretty vulnerable place to be, is going to be creepy. And I know there'll be people going, well, how could you tell that wasn't just a dream? But I think the fact that the guy at the front already knew that there was weird activity in that part of the hotel just confirms that this was a weird experience, whichever way you slice it. So I'm glad I read that after I've just been staying in a hotel, but no, because that might have freaked me out otherwise. And this is our final story submitted by listeners. And this one again is anonymous, but it happened to the person's childhood friend in Norman, Oklahoma. And they said, my friend and his wife had a new baby, and the baby monitor was in their room. One evening, when the wife of my friend was getting ready to change the baby's diaper, she placed the baby on their queen-size bed. She turned facing away from sight of the baby to grab the changing supplies. In that time, the baby rolled to the very edge of the bed, about to roll off. At that moment, she heard a soft feminine voice through the monitor that said, "Watch the baby," just in time before the baby fell. The mother grabbed the baby and all was well. Friendly ghost at work? I'd say so. That is really cool. Also kind of scary, because obviously that would have been really bad if the baby had fallen off the bed. But at the same time, really helpful that there was someone keeping an eye out. And also, why did the voice come through the monitor? Where was the person watching from? Which actually makes that a little bit more weird. But yeah, helpful ghost. And this is one of the things, because we always end up thinking about scary ghosts and malevolent things and horrible things and stuff like that. And normally at this point in the proceedings, this would be where I would tell you some of my supernatural experiences. And to be honest, none of them have really been terrifying. They've all been kind of weird or almost humdrum, which makes it really difficult when you try and tell them because they're not scary. But this particular experience I'd completely forgotten about until I was at an event for the All the Terrible Things podcast last week, and I ended up telling this one while I was there. So I thought, well, do you know what? I'm going to tell it again because I think this fits in really nicely with the story that we've just ended with. And this is the idea of helpful ghosts, which could potentially cross over with brownies. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't classify, but anyway. So I used to work in London, as I think I might have mentioned before, and the office that I managed backed onto Bunhill Fields, which is that little cemetery between City Road and Bunhill Row. It's a nice little cemetery. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but let's be honest, this is me. And it's also like a lovely place where office workers will go and eat their lunch in the summer because it's a piece of outdoor greenery in London. So people will pretty much take their moment with nature anywhere that they can find it. And it was really funny because the number of times I would go in the morning and I'd be the first one in. So obviously I'd open the shutters. I knew nobody else was in the building because I'd had to open the shutters to actually get in. And when I say building, I mean on our floor. Obviously there were flats and things above the office. And I would often get this distinct impression that there was somebody standing right at the back of the office in one corner and they were just watching what I was doing. They weren't doing anything else. I can't even explain who they were, what they were doing, or anything. It was just the sensation of being watched, but not in a horrible way, in like a curious, oh, you're back again kind of way. So me being me, I would always say good morning as I then went round to go and put the kettle on, because obviously the first thing you do when you get into the office is you have a cuppa. So I'd say hello to whoever figure number one was. And then there was a little office at the back that was like a separate little annex kind of thing. And periodically I would go in there, and if it had been left particularly untidy the night before, it would certainly feel a lot tidier when I went in. And the stationery cupboard was nearly always left in a mess, and it used to irritate me so much because there were drawers for everything, there was places to put everything, but people would just go in and throw supplies everywhere looking for the thing that they wanted, but they would just leave it in an absolute tip. And there would be times again where the cupboard was suddenly tidy, and I was like, you know what, I'm the only person in this building who will actually tidy mess. Because obviously people don't really want to disturb other people's desks, but in terms of the cupboard, I was the only one who ever tidied that. And people had to be told to tidy their desk. So when I would come in and all of a sudden the desk would actually be a lot more tidy, I'd be like, that was not done by the person who worked there. That was done by someone else. And the vibe in that office was different from the front office. So I used to get the feeling it was figure number two who was doing that. And I thought, obviously, when you then look at folklore and you look at brownies tidying untidy spaces and then messing up tidy spaces, you do think, did we have a brownie at work? Or did we have a helpful ghost who knew how annoyed I got about the mess and decided to give a hand? I don't know. But it was funny because, again, I would walk in and I would say hello, and you would just get like a friendly kind of feeling, like whoever it was acknowledging my presence while they were going about and doing their thing. It wasn't every day that it happened. And generally speaking, it only happened when I was in alone. If somebody else was already in the office, I didn't always get the same feeling. So I don't quite know what that was. But again, I could have just been imagining the whole thing. Let's be honest, it's possible. But it was always a nice feeling to have in the office, that there was somebody there helping, giving a hand, and that I wasn't actually in the office on my own, if that makes sense. So I think I was only maybe there once by myself late at night, because most of the time other people would leave after me, and I was never bothered about being in there when it was dark, despite the fact that you could go out into the little garden and look over the wall into a graveyard. Most people would find that creepy, not me. But then, as I say, having these two different presences in the office always kind of made it feel a bit more lived in, if that makes sense. So I did feel it was important to include another helpful ghost, because we have had some creepy stuff in this episode. So I thought it would be quite nice to end on a slightly higher note, because that's me. Did I encounter spirits at work? Who knows, but it was certainly a strange experience. But anyway, that is the end of this installment of listener experiences. I will no doubt ask for more in the future, because I do think that these stories are important to preserve, because obviously if you don't, they disappear, and because some of them are about places that other people might encounter, it's quite helpful to have them recorded. But even just for them to be recorded kind of helps the person who's telling them know that other people have heard the experience. But then it also, I think, helps whoever the experience is from in a supernatural sense, because obviously their point of view is then preserved as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. So we are going to be looking at the folklore of islands, which is obviously the second time we've done this theme, and it's just basically because there's that many islands with so much folklore, then there's bound to be plenty for me to dig into. If there are anything specific that you want me to have a look at, then obviously give me a shout and I'll have a look. We've already got the episodes on the main feed. I have actually done the folklore of Jersey and Guernsey as bonus episodes on Patreon, so I will make those available for sale if you want to buy that one specifically, just rather than me coming back and doing it on the main feed and so on. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed those listener experiences, and I'll see you next week when we get back to Islands again. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.